Hello and welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. I'm Guillaume, your host, and each week I'm fortunate to share with you stories from climate tech founders, investors, and corporations sharing their unique insights into this fast-moving industry. Eventually, like me, you will learn, discover, and get inspired by those unique men and women who are contributing to the fight against climate change, and I hope it will help you to take a step in this formidable movement. So before we start, I just want to share a few words about us, as this podcast is just the tip of the iceberg of what we do at Startup Basecamp to support the climate tech movement. Our mission is to accelerate capital deployment towards climate tech founders, allowing them to focus on scaling their solutions. How do we do that? Every day, we help founders access to resources and connection and gain the visibility they need to expand their growth. We do this in a number of ways with a membership platform, a Slack group with a growing number of founders, investors, and experts from around the world. And recently, we went one step further with the matching services to connect founders with top climate tech investors. Keep in mind that we are able to do all of this thanks to the support of our listeners and our members. So please like and subscribe, share one episode with a friend, join a community, and if you haven't already done so, make a small donation to support our work. It really means the world to us. And now, enjoy the show! Hi everyone, during this new episode of Founder Series, we sat down with Tristan Foerster, co-founder and CEO at ClimatePartner. ClimatePartner helps businesses on the long journey of reducing and abating carbon emissions by enabling them to carbon footprint their emissions and offset unabatable emissions through the projects it has developed with its partners across the globe. Tristan's story was unique and fascinating, and I was super excited and really enjoy learning about his journey towards helping businesses be carbon neutral. Tristan has had a variety of experiences from early search engines to e-commerce startup, then to consulting before working for matchmaking software. Tristan joined Climate Partners 12 years ago and hasn't looked back since then. Including Scope 3 emissions, retail accounts for 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In this episode, Tristan dissects how he helps retailers account for their carbon emissions and why double accounting is actually necessary for improving accountability. He then dove into the intricacies of retail and why emissions are so hard to offset, why that meant that ClimatePartner had to exist, how he developed the company, and how it works today. During the second part of the show, Tristan gives his tips on how to make it, even if your company functions as an involuntary non-profit for several years. He then gives us a glimpse on ways he had found to reach a good work-life balance and what sources of information he uses to stay abreast of the climate landscape. Tristan, welcome to the show. Hi, Tristan. Welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. I'm super happy to have you here with us today. I believe it's going to be a great opportunity to hear your story and learn more about your exciting adventure to decarbonize our economy and accelerate corporate climate action with ClimatePartner. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. I'm looking very much forward to our conversation. Thanks for having me.
So you're welcome. And so before we start, this is the tradition on the show now. Can you give us a 30-second intro about Climate Partners?
Absolutely. So what do we do at Climate Partner? We enable businesses to take climate action. And how do we do that? In principle, we enable businesses to carbon footprint their business and their products. We help them on the long journey of reducing and abating carbon emissions. And unabated emissions can be offset with our carbon offset projects that we develop ourselves and with partners all across the globe so that you can become a carbon neutral company or offer carbon neutral products, which we also label as such. So there is a label that says that a product is carbon neutral and gets the transparency around all the climate action that these businesses are taking to actually move forward and going on their path to net zero.
So let's start from the top. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about your personal story and background? What are you passionate about? What do you love to do besides building climate partners? I mean, what makes you feel, inspired or like your best self? As I always ask, like, who's Tristan?
So what I really love about the combination of what we're doing is we're working with businesses on taking climate action. And the one thing is the climate action part in itself. So the purpose of our company at Climate Partner is called improving lives. And that's what I live for actually every day, improving lives in our business sense, especially in carbon offset projects where we're really helping the poorest people in this world, not only reduce carbon emissions or sequester carbon emissions, but actually improving their livelihoods, getting them to school, reducing poverty, getting them an education, making sure that they get work, and to actually live better lives. All these sustainable development goals that are actually improved by carbon offset projects, but that only is restricted not only to the carbon offset projects, but also to our people at Climate Partner, improving our own lives, the way we live and what we want to do, and the lives of our future generations, which is why we're taking climate action. So that's the one thing I'm very passionate about. It's improving lives topic and purpose of Climate Partner. And what I love about the B2B business is that it's always a people business. So you're always in contact with other people because behind the businesses are the people actually driving this business. Very often in B2C businesses, it's quite can be quite impersonal because you're talking to a very, very large crowd of potential customers. But in the B2B area, you're constantly in contact with people that are passionate about taking climate action and this collaborative journey together with people that have a lot of leverage in their business. That's what I'm really passionate about. And I'm meeting all different kinds of businesses every single day and new people every single day to drive this whole topic and also improving lives through this leverage.
So tell us a bit more about your previous work and life experience. And I know that you joined Climate Partners very, very early stage. I mean, you mentioned on your profile that I think you were like 5 or 10 employees at that time. I mean, before the really like jumping into Climate Partners, like what did you learn along the journey that you had prior to that that in a way gave you an edge to really start off the company?
It's funny because if I talk to some people nowadays that knew me from all the way earlier, they're saying I came from the dark side of the force and moved to the good side of the force with Climate Partner. Before that, I had lots of different experiences in different companies, ranging from my first job was at a startup. It was called Lycos Europe, which was actually a search engine at the time, the second largest after Yahoo before Google overtook everything. Then moved to start my own company that crashed and burned in 2000 in e-commerce, and then had a lot of experience in consulting, so strategy consulting for financial services, something very different. Before moving into a business, into the digital business again for online matchmaking. So very different areas of experience that I could then actually use for Climate Partner, coming from the consulting background, but also the digital background, and combining that for these skills for Climate Partner, which I joined now more than 12 years ago. And so my best friend Moritz Lehmkuhl had founded Climate Partner in the meantime, and I was able to join then 5 years after he had founded the company with, like you said, very few people at the time, and for a very long time staying a very small company until the last recent years where we actually see exceptional growth.
So you mentioned this, these different hats that you were wearing in your previous life before, like client partners or being on the dark side of the forest, as you were mentioning. But what has been your driver in a way to jump into this climate, that we call today climate tech industry? Any specific aha moment that you can recall or would define as such that really helped you to do that jump?
So maybe that jump came. at a lot earlier stage, but was kind of incepted in me when I was young. I grew up in a German town called Freiburg, and Freiburg is known in Germany as the greenest town in Germany. So they're very, very early. They were I think the first mayor that came from the Green Party as a mayor of the city. And I separated I recycled my garbage before I went to school even. So it was at a very early stage that I got in contact with these things. I know my parents-in-law and now my brother-in-law, they have an organic winery. So I've always been in contact with this topic around sustainability. And while I was working as a consultant and moving into the tech area, and I've been to so many tech conferences and know a lot of very, very successful tech founders in the realm. And I came to a point where I said, okay, my next step would be either to found my own. I would want to found my own business. I want to become an entrepreneur again. And I was seeing what Moritz was doing with ClimatePartner, and I said, wow, it wasn't working yet, but the vision was there that it could be a really interesting company because we were very early stage in 2006 when it was founded, 2011 when I joined. A very early stage in the sense of, wow, is this going to be a company that is viable, that actually businesses want to get consulting and software solutions in climate action. But the point was that if I found a business, I want to be giving something back to society and to contribute to society every single day, working at least 8 hours a day, mostly 10, 12, even more hours a day, and contribute to what you're doing at work. And why not have something where you actually contribute positively to society rather than just growing revenues and becoming profitable? So that was my goal at that point. And I started looking and I said, what can I do to actually achieve this goal? Because I was seeing what Moritz was doing. And then we got into more and more conversations around the topic, and we decided to join forces and to do that together because we had a company 10 years earlier, and that had not worked, but now ClimatePartner was there, and I knew that if I want to do something, and it wasn't that easy really to find any kind of business models that would actually work in that sense. To have most businesses at the time in that realm were NGOs, and I definitely didn't want to build an NGO because I'm not the type. I wanted to have a sustainable, efficient, profit-driven business because that drives efficiency and drives scale. And so we joined forces at ClimatePartner. That was the driver. I said, I really want to copy this model that Moritz had, but if you can't beat them, join them. So we joined forces there, and that's what gave me the passion for ClimatePartner.
So before we go and start to go into detail about climate partners, I would like to zoom out and kind of understand this overall context that you are surfing on, and more specifically based on our prior discussion, I would like to get your insight and overview of the impact that retail can have on climate change. And maybe we can start with like your larger definition of retail and the insights that you have regarding which part of the retails are the main emitters and their respective emission contribution to the whole GSG emission that we have today.
Definitely. Let me give you a little bit of a segue why we're talking about retail in the first place. Is in the end, at ClimatePartner, we developed a label that you can put on a product that says that a product is carbon neutral. And that is something that is very strong for consumers to make choices along, am I consuming let's say, a more carbon friendly or more sustainable product? Which all of a sudden brought retailers onto the idea of, that's a way that I can actually depict to my customers that I'm taking climate action. So that's how we as ClimatePartner got involved in the retail industry all of a sudden, because it's on products and retailers sell consumer products. And so we got involved with the retail industry, I would say, very strongly, starting with a large retailer in Germany, Aldi, you also know internationally, in 2018. And so we had a look at the industry, and it's very interesting to see the development in the industry, in the retail industry, because the point is, if you're looking at carbon emissions, you typically, or doing a carbon footprint of a business, you typically divide them into three different so-called scopes. So if you're looking at the scope one of the emissions of a retailer specifically, you're looking at where do they combust fossil fuels to generate energy, for example, themselves, or where do they have leakage in cooling agents for their refrigeration that they need, especially in the food retail industry. So that's something where they directly have an influence on producing carbon emissions. And secondly, what's very strong, what's being looked at as a scope 2 emissions is that's any kind of energy that I procure, like electricity and heating and potentially cooling as well, that I buy from third parties, so from utilities and energy producing. So that is something that retailers really have looked at for a very long time because they know it. It's in their stores. You know, most of the retail industry is still in stores. It's only about 23% are online. The rest is all still in stores. So it's 76. 77% of retail overall globally is still done in stores. So they're looking at their stores, my electricity, my lighting, my cooling, and things like that. So all of a sudden, this new initiative comes along called Science-Based Targets, is a global NGO initiative saying, well, you have to, as a business, have to commit to reducing your carbon footprint along a science-based methodology, coming to a net zero base by 2050, which is where we all need to be headed as a global economy. And all of a sudden, science-based targets as well, you as a retailer, you have to be responsible for your so-called scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that are caused by your activities as a business. So now guess what the scope 3 emissions are for retailers? It's the products that they sell. And the products that they sell, first of all, have the huge carbon footprint from where they're being produced by suppliers or by vendors. Before that are brands. And they also have a huge carbon footprint when consumers use those products in the end. And all of a sudden, retailers are faced with the responsibility for the products they're selling. And guess what? Those scope 3 emissions make up, in the end, 90 to 98% of the emissions of these retailers. And if you add that all up, and you ask for some statistics around that, if you add that all up and you're looking at the whole scope 3 emissions of all retailers out there, and alone in the US, there's more than 1 million retailers, and the very, very long tail retailers. You have a lot of big ones as well. I can talk about that a little bit in a second too. But in the end, if you look at this whole assessment by a study by BCG that's been done, retail is responsible for, now hold tight, 25% of all global emissions, if you include all the scope 3 emissions. So all the producing of products, the packaging of those products, distributing them, getting them to consumers actually utilizing these products accounts for, it always depends how you slice the cake, but in the end, retail in that sense is responsible for 1/4 of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And if you think about that global greenhouse gas emissions per year that are being emitted are 35 gigatons. So that's more than 8 billion tons that retail is responsible for globally. So you can imagine what the influence is that retail can have on actually abating these emissions, or all of a sudden has this responsibility that they didn't feel they had before. And this has been happening in the past few years. And there is the big, really interesting thing is, how do you abate this? How do you cope with this? Because if you're only actually directly responsible, let's say scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as a textile retailer, that's 2% of your emissions. And all the others are caused by the producers of the goods that you're selling, that you're actually not, you're actually just buying and selling these products in the end. But how do you actually get a grip on that? And that's where the huge difficulty comes in for retailers to speak and collaborate with their supply chain on reducing emissions.
So out of your curiosity, I mean, in this calculation, and you guys are like highly specialized in calculating all of that. Like, how do you avoid like double accounting between what the retailers is taking into account in terms of like all of those scope 3 emissions and making sure that the producer of like those goods are not then accounted into the same pie, and where do you draw the line as well in this cascade effect where finally the final I would say the retailer or the final vendor is carrying the hat for everybody who's not maybe doing the best job prior to that.
So to be clear, double counting is wanted in the system, right? Because you want to get this responsibility on several shoulders. And you want to get the push of actually being able to reduce these carbon emissions and actually assessing different activities that businesses are having, and making them responsible for that. So, otherwise you're always just blaming somebody else. Okay, you take care of your own things, and I'm not responsible. I'm, as a retailer, I'm not responsible for the shampoo emissions that I'm selling, or the shirt emissions. I'm not responsible for that. And that's what's been happening. So no, but you are responsible for that as well, despite the fact that you are not specifically generating the carbon emissions that somebody weaving the material for this shirt is generating in India somewhere. So you explicitly want this double counting to enforce this collaboration on reducing emissions. Typically, if you look at it at a macroeconomic level, um, you could cancel out every double counting by simply counting the scope 1 emissions. Period. So only the scope 1 emissions where I'm actually causing direct carbon emissions through producing energy or agriculture, chemical processes, and manufacturing, things like that. That's where the scope 1 emissions come in. And the scope 2 emissions, buying energy from utilities, are the scope 1 emissions of the utilities.
That is,
you see. And the scope 3 emissions are distributed and double counted definitely across all the different industries. But that's the mechanism that actually the methodology behind it wants to trigger, so that a store. Let's take a store. Let's look at, I don't know, Walmart selling a men's shirt. Interestingly enough, this is a white men's shirt. You know how many tiers that typically an average has over the production of one single men's shirt? 13. 13 tiers, meaning 13 industrial steps to produce a shirt produced by 13 different companies. So that's from producing the cotton to weaving the material to weaving the threads and producing the buttons. And that whole thing goes around the world. Imagine, so you're producing cotton in India, it's manufactured somewhere in Vietnam, and in the end, it's shipped to Europe to be for all the design around it. And it's another finishing step somewhere else in the world, and it's being sold somewhere in the US. So it's crazy for this single shirt who all is involved. But in the end, you'll have Walmart saying, "Hey, listen, I'm only responsible for the lights in my house and in my shop, and the and the bit of the logistics behind it." And that's where it comes in. So no, you have to start to work with your main emissions producers in your supply chain to think about how can I actually get green energy, for example, into the weaving companies of the material. So that's the interesting part.
According to you, in this, and you mentioned this example of the shirt, I heard about the jeans, Levi's jeans or whatever, like example also that were touring the world prior to land in the customer hands. But what are, like, if you could like maybe mention one or two challenges and opportunity that you see in the market to accelerate this decarbonization of the retail industry in general. I mean, and maybe taking a little bit more like the angle of like the regulation that which one are currently in place to drive this decarbonization, and maybe if you can tell us which one are maybe missing. I mean, we always hear about carbon taxes or the hypothesis behind that. So I mean, what's blocking in a way and slowing down this decarbonization of the retail industry?
So there's two big leverages that regulation can actually have on any big task that has to be solved in some sort of way. If you look on the one hand side, it's either through incentives, so subsidies in the end, so that actually the state investing into certain areas, or it's taxation. So putting a bad on a certain behavior that the industry is having. Both work in a certain way. So you have regulation. If you look regulations in Europe on cars, for example. So there's a regulation, and that's getting more and more strict on the emissions that a car is actually allowed to have as an overall fleet of new cars are being produced that has emissions per 100 kilometers that you have to be lower than, and if you don't adhere to that, you have to pay tremendous amounts of taxation on that in order to adhere to the system. So that's one way of regulating. Another way of regulating is incentivizing research and development, for example. So if you look at the development of the internet, that was actually a big, huge investment of the US government into military tech that came up with the internet in the end. And that's benefiting the whole society globally, of course. So I'm more of a friend of the incentivizing part of things. That's what's happening for incentivizing the use of green energy, for example. So in the US, new regulations are coming up around the Lowering Inflation Act in the end, or the Counter-Inflation Act that's being set up by the Biden administration. That's helping a lot, but it's still not getting us where we actually want to be. It's one of the reasons also we founded ClimatePartner in the beginning, is because we can't wait for regulation to come because it's too slow. Carbon tax, there's always schemes being set up, but very often too not strict enough. So you don't have the incentives really to move into that, and there's still a lot happening on the voluntary basis. So what I think is a very strong lever is if several parties work together, and that's a bit what's missing. So what's missing is definitely regulation. If you would have stronger regulation around incentivizing using renewable energy or investing into renewable technology or climate tech in general, that would be great. Penalizing the use of coal, for example, to generate energy, that would work. But also investors have a huge leverage. Who do the investors actually give money to? And investors actually saying more and more. You see from Larry Fink from BlackRock constantly saying, well, we only want to invest in sustainable businesses in the end. Why? Because there's a huge risk for them to invest in businesses that are fossil fuel based, because they know that's, first of all, is a finite resource. Secondly, there's a huge risk in actually making these industries going out of business because it's the right thing to do, and that's the way the economy is moving, and we have to get there. So they're actually reassessing their investments to actually more sustainable businesses. And I think the combination of regulation combined with investment, so making investment more lucrative and maybe even sponsoring that as an incentive into reducing carbon emissions in retail, we're talking about into the supply chain, into vendors and the production, that is something that could really accelerate the topic, other than simply voluntary action. There's a strong argument for voluntary action on top of though as well, because you see with our new generations, Generation Z coming up, generations that are actually demanding. So there's a lot of consumer demand there, demanding more sustainable ways of production, more sustainable ways of moving forward, and actually willing to pay for that as well, actually willing to pay a premium on more sustainable goods. They are also, voting by feet, voting, I'm going to consume this product rather than another product. And vendors and retailers are picking up on that and says, oh, well, I see that to satisfy the demand, the more sustainable demand coming from consumers, I have to produce my goods differently. I have to cooperate differently with producers and suppliers in order to deliver more sustainable products in the end. So let's take an example of that. Let's move away from the shirts and the jeans we talked about. Let's move to food. food is very interesting to look at, because if you're looking at the consumer side of things, which is pretty much common knowledge in the meantime, is that consuming meat, so the gram of protein you get out of a kilogram of meat is much more effective on carbon emissions if you move away from meat. So beef has like 4 times the emissions of a piece of chicken, and chicken again has 4 times the amount of carbon emissions than, let's say, tofu. So beef has almost 10 times the carbon emissions of tofu for the amount of protein you get out of it, because you're actually feeding beef the soy instead of making tofu out of it that you can consume directly, that is turning actually into a kilogram of meat that you would consume later on. At the meantime, emitting tons and tons of carbon emissions through methane that cows produce by regurgitating, and by their feces. So in the end, it has to do a lot with consumer, the way consumers behave. And if you can, that's where climate tech industry comes in as well. So we're not only talking about climate tech in the deep tech sense of things, but climate tech also in the sense of food technology. So how can I actually satisfy the demand of more and more protein being demanded by consumers? Also a lot of consumers coming into the middle class in countries like India and China that all of a sudden want to consume meat. We can't sustain the world on meat, but we can potentially find substitutes for meat. And that's what I mean with a food tech comes in. Companies like Impossible that have actually made meat that is not meat really tastes good. And that's just the beginning. It's just the tip of the iceberg of what can happen to transition. So it's the demand from consumers coming in. Listen, I still want to have that meaty taste, that umami meat taste. But so if you don't produce a product that tastes like that, I'm not going to buy it. I'm still going to stick with meat. But if there's all of a sudden a huge selection of that is driven by retail, that is driven by producers, that is driven by innovative new companies coming into the sector, all of a sudden you have a choice, and you can choose a much more climate-friendly substitute for things. So just on this example of a meat substitute or a dairy substitute, that's where you have to start to work together, and that's where we're seeing a lot of collaboration happening with large retailers working, for example, with dairy producers. Because how do I get that carbon footprint of milk reduced by looking at what do I feed the cow in the end, or where does the cow graze? How can I combine, animal welfare together with a lower carbon footprint of the product I'm producing, or how can I actually substitute for this? And that's where that's the big keyword and the big challenge that we have is collaboration across supply chains that has not been there before. Before it's always the retailer is, in the end, the food retailer is the one purchasing, and has the purchasing power, and says, well, you have to deliver me a liter of milk for 49 cents, and that's it. That's what we're negotiating on. And now they're all of a sudden saying, maybe I actually don't want to buy that milk, and maybe I want to make sure that the carbon footprint of the milk is also a criteria that I'm looking at when buying milk to sell to my consumers. This collaboration, that's a huge topic that is extremely necessary, and it's coming privately, so on the voluntary side of the privately held companies, but that could also be a huge incentive set up by regulation to drive it forward.
Yeah. So, and thanks for sharing this more like holistic view. And I think the collaboration aspect is always probably the most challenging part of it. But according to you, and to close this section, based on your data points, which sectors in the retail industry that you guys are covering and that you study, on a daily basis, I would say, do you see extremely hard and difficult to deploy those alternative and that can provide I would say accurate and efficient ways to produce something different that are climate friendly, I would say? Do you see maybe subcategories or sectors where it's really difficult and where it's excessively like challenging at this time to do it?
So I must unfortunately say it's everywhere. It's very difficult to say this is the most challenging. So if you talk to the food industry, they're saying we have the most challenging part because um, we 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 are trying to face consumer demand. Let's take mineral water. You know, mineral water in especially in Europe, also we're buying bottled water. We're putting water into bottles and shipping it across, miles and miles of distance to sell water to consumers that actually just get it out of the tap. But they're actually adhering to consumer demand because somehow they've set up the myth that water from bottles is healthier than out of the water tap, which is not true. There is no trade-off there in the end. It's just about branding and things like that. So the food industry will say we have huge challenges on the packaging side. So how do I actually package this water? Is it in PET? Is it in glass? Do I have recyclables? Do I have a system behind it? So that's a huge challenge on a very simple product already that just puts water in bottles and ships it from A to B. And then it's the shipping itself. That's interesting for any kind of industry. How do I get a product from A to B? So transportation in the US, for example, is probably the highest, one of the highest sectors of carbon emission factors because, well, it's huge. US is huge, and if you're importing from from Asia, it ends up in a port in San Francisco. How do you get that product to Washington D.C.? You have to ship it across the whole country, and the other way around if something comes from Europe. So the transportation industry is there. So you have to look at the single slots within the industry. If you're looking at the cosmetics industry, let's say, take an example I always like is the detergent industry. Just consumer goods. I want to wash my back to the jeans. I need to wash the jeans, and I'm wearing the jeans. And the big question is also double and triple counting. Who do I assess the usage of my clothing to? Do I assess it to the jeans? Do I assess it to the detergent? So because I have to wash my jeans, right? And if I'm washing my jeans and I don't have green energy, that's depending on how often I wash my jeans. I'm actually, producing carbon emissions because I'm procuring brown energy because it's burning coal somewhere to wash my jeans. So now the jeans are saying, well, I have to assess it to the jeans, the washing of the jeans. The detergent people say, well, no, but I have to assess it to my detergent because it's about 10, the factor is only 10% of the detergent's production, but like 90% are the use of the detergent. Do you assess it to the washing machine that you actually bought, or do you assess it to your personal electricity use? So I know for myself, I procure green energy, so I've completely lowered that part, and I've been wearing these pair of jeans that I have on for the past 10 years. So it's a lot about behavior there as well. But if you're looking at the industries, every single industry in retail has their challenges. Consumer electronics as well. So the consumer electronics is, I have my phone here that you probably have lying around there as well. Um, they're incentivizing buying a new phone every 2 years because that's how they grow their revenues and their sales. But do you need a new phone every 2 years? Definitely not. But the production with consumer electronics with all the metals that you have in here and the glass, it's huge carbon footprint for the product. So it's a bit a contradiction between capitalism and saving the environment because that's always the thing that we have trying to generate growth. But the big question is how can it still generate growth with more sustainable products and with a much lower carbon footprint? And that's where all industries can learn from one another. Look at e-commerce, also a huge topic. The huge challenge for e-commerce, for example, is the last mile. So you can ship in bulk. You can ship in bulk on ships from Asia to the US, for example, or to Europe. That has a fairly low carbon footprint per product in the end, per kilogram of product. But in the end, and then you ship it to your central distribution area that you have. And from that central distribution, you might ship it to the store. So, but in e-commerce, you have your central distribution unit, and then you ship it to the consumer in the end. So that last mile Of course, as a huge retailer, let's look at the largest retailer overall, Amazon, has the topic of how do that's what they're really responsible for is, of course, this last mile of delivering product to the consumer. And the last mile is always the most inefficient because you don't always get the cars full and it's always driving back and forth and how to get that product to the consumer. And the big challenge there is how do I get these vehicles to run on, for example, electricity and run on renewable energy, which is a great idea, or on other types of fuel that is carbon neutral, uh, like synthetic fuels or hydrogen and things like that. But let's take electricity. Um, Now they're having a huge issue of actually getting those cars on the road because of supply chain issues that we're having in the past 3 years due to the pandemic and to the zero COVID strategy of in China, and now a huge procurement topic with the Ukraine crisis that we're having. So they are having trouble reaching their goals on moving to more electric vehicles with renewable energy, which would really lower their carbon footprint on distribution because of supply chain issues. So you see, it's difficult to pinpoint that's the industry with those the most challenges, but it's I think it's across the whole retail industry, selling consumer goods, selling clothing, selling DIY articles. They all have a similar problem, and that's I have to work with the producer, I have to work with the vendor who produces the goods, and I have to reduce the carbon emissions of the usage of a product at the end of the cycle, because that's all that together is more than 90% of the emissions.
So now let's go deeper into Climate Partners. I mean, what's the story behind it, and for who is it? I mean, which gap did you guys identify initially that led to the current version of Climate Partners, and in a way, why did Climate Partners have to exist?
Absolutely. So um, after Morris and I had our first company in 2000 and we went broke, I needed the money, so I joined a consulting company and was lucky there. Moritz went on to do different independent things, but at one point in time, and he had been with an investment bank before. There was a spin-off from this investment bank, and they were actually doing projects for the European Union in climate action. So developing carbon offset projects and trying to get funding for actually getting climate action moving forward. Um, and at one point in time, they were trying all different kinds of things, and it was very, very difficult to constantly have to get funding from the European Union and have ideas, and they ended up somewhere in a drawer and nobody ever used them. But at one point in time, Moritz approached the German Postal Service. German Postal Service, now pretty much known across the world as DHL after it's been privatized, um, and approached them and said, "Listen, I have an idea. Why don't you send your packages? Since we're talking about sending in last mile before, why don't you send your packages carbon neutrally? So I can tell you what the carbon emissions are of sending a package, and we can offset these emissions with carbon offset projects. So that is carbon neutral." And then everybody would profit from that because the consumer thinks that's great, has contribution to that. That it's good for the business, and maybe even Climate Partner could be, build a business out of that, consulting the German postal service. And they said, "You know what, Moritz, great idea. Thank you very much, but we don't need you for that. We could do that on our own." So that was the first door closed, but it opened up the door to the idea of actually, get, enabling businesses to take climate action, and setting up a system of it's very similar across for every kind of business. How do I, what are my carbon emissions? What are the carbon emissions of my product? And how can I reduce these? And how can I actually mitigate them through carbon offset projects? And that was where the idea of Climate Partner was born. And it, then we came by chance into an industry that you would not imagine that we actually that got our breakthrough of things. And if you would lock a lot of scientists and great minds and consultants into one room and give them a whole week time, they would never come up with this one industry, and that was the printing industry. Interestingly enough. So why the printing industry? Well, we in Germany at the time, that's where Climate Partner started. At that time, there were 12,000 printing companies out there. mean, every village had their own printing company, printing some kind of postcards and flyers and pamphlets and stuff like that, and sustainability reports and year annual reports and so on. But they're having trouble because of digitization. And big online printing companies coming about, and they're all going broke. And we were family businesses, 4 or 5 people working there, and they're all going broke. And we had a friend who had an advertising agency, and he said, "Listen, don't you guys have an idea for these printing industries that are really in trouble?" And we said, "Well, we've got nothing to lose. We didn't have many customers at the time." So, okay, well, let's set up a calculator to calculate the carbon footprint of a printing business. And let's set up a second calculator that calculates the carbon emissions of a print job. So, like printing an annual report, for example. And then we'll offset these emissions with a carbon offset project, and we'll put a label on the print product that says this product has been printed carbon neutrally. Let's see what happens. And it worked, because all of a sudden you had the printing companies. They didn't have to pay for that. They handed the price on to the print buyers. Then the price was only about 0.5%, 1% extra on top of the print job. And for that, they would get a carbon neutral annual report that said on it, it's carbon neutral. And they said, oh wow, this actually underlines my sustainability activities, and then putting the money where the mouth is. I'm making sure that the print jobs that I'm doing are carbon neutral. And it had for us the advantage that our label was on it, and that our name on it. So all of a sudden we had huge, you know, eyeballs on what we're doing there as well through this mechanism. And then we had at one point in time 100, 200 printing companies in our portfolio, and we decided we noticed we can't just drive around all of Germany with a laptop and an Excel table and calculate carbon emissions. We have to develop software for that to make it accessible through software as a service. And that's what happened then. So in 2009, we started developing software around transforming this print business calculation into a software as a service on carbon footprinting, reducing and offsetting carbon emissions. And that was the seed that was sown at the time. And then many years, nothing happened at all. We tried to get into other industries, and we tried to get into the packaging industry. And many years later, all of a sudden it started to work, that the packaging industry was also interested. And then through packaging, then consumer goods. And through the consumer goods industries, then we're back, that closes the loop, back to the retail industry that uses actually the same system, but in a much more sophisticated way, of course, that we've had ever since 2009 to develop this software as a service. And very importantly, combined with consulting service, a personal service for the businesses out there.
So it sounds like really like this time to market. You guys were like able to crunch it and cross the chasm before like this new influx of like interest and necessary need of like companies to change, like that happened probably around like, and you probably felt it around like 2019, 2020. I guess that's where you felt this acceleration. So if you can tell us a bit more about the product side in itself, and maybe not going into each details, but kind of like give us like this, value chain, and help us to visualize how Climate Partners work, like as a new company. If I want to get work with you guys, what's the onboarding process looks like, what's the outcome, the support that you guys give to the companies. I mean, like, let us understand your secret sauce there.
Oh, definitely. I think maybe the one thing to look at is what we're trying to do, and what differentiates us from other competitors in the market is that we're really a one-stop shop in climate action for businesses. So we have a portfolio of things that we can do for businesses, and we enable businesses to go their next level of climate action on their climate action journey, no matter where they're at. So if you're talking to a business that is really small, has never done anything in climate action, we can start with them. But we can also work with, let's say, a bank that's been taking climate action for the last 15, 20 years, but still can't get the carbon footprint in their portfolio moving, or to procure offsets and develop their own personal offset projects for them. So it's a one-stop shop. Once you start working with ClimatePartner, you can actually enter at any point, and you can actually get services from any point. But if you go through the value chain, let's say you haven't done anything in climate action so far. Let's say you are the producer of, I don't know, one one that we did this with cosmetics, right? Because it's also like a link again to to the retail industry. So like typically creams and shampoos, and it's a company that's very sustainable because they produce natural cosmetics. And they approached us one time and said, "Listen, um, I heard that that you have in your portfolio businesses that produce carbon neutral packaging." So yes, that's the case. So we enable them to procure businesses with carbon neutral packaging. And then they said, "Oh wow, that's in carbon neutral packaging, that's only one part of the whole product, And it's they're saying, well, it says carbon neutral packaging. That's not, why carbon neutral packaging? Why don't you do the whole product?" Well, yes, but give the businesses time, and that's what we're really looking at is giving entry points for businesses to take climate action, not having to climb Mount Everest in one way. You go to the base camp first, and then you start moving, and then all of a sudden they started to go through the whole process with it. Okay, I understood. How do we do this now in a real comprehensive way? Well, first you have to start with a carbon footprint of your business. And that's where we have the software developed. So we request data from this company, consumption data, and that's very important. Real consumption data on the products, the raw materials that they have, the packaging that they have, the logistics that they're setting up. Everything that goes into their energy of producing these goods with their partners, and then you get a carbon footprint of the business. And then you say, okay, well, let's break it down to the products, would be then the second step. So how much does this one shampoo actually emit if it's produced? And then you look at the different rows of shampoos and the creams and so on, and you can do a little bit of bundling around that, but you can really pinpoint and say, okay, this shampoo with this packaging, with this logistics around it that I need, has a carbon footprint of X. So now you know the product carbon footprint. And once you have the company carbon footprint and the product carbon footprint, then you can pinpoint the highlights, the high energy drivers, the high carbon footprint drivers in those products. So is it the packaging? Is it the cosmetics itself? Is it the energy that I'm using? Is it the energy of my suppliers that I have to look at? And then you could set up a climate action strategy on how to get maybe science-based even to reduce your carbon footprint as much as possible. And if you're adhering to science-based targets initiatives, you want to be down by 90% down by 2050 at the latest, so that you only have 10% left. And the point is, today you can't just switch a switch and move to zero carbon emissions. That's the problem. So you need a way to abate or to mitigate these carbon emissions. And one methodology there is to offset these emissions that you can't abate at the moment. With carbon offset projects, and that's the next step where we develop carbon offset projects across the globe, from forestation projects, afforestation projects, clean energy projects, blue carbon, so things like mangrove plantations, clean cook stoves and things like that to actually offset these emissions. So at the end, you have a carbon neutral product. And then the whole cycle starts again, because the main issue, the most difficulty in business is actually to reduce your carbon emissions. And that means it takes investments, it takes decisions of rechanging your production facilities and so on. So, and that's where we accompany the whole business. In the end, we're also there to help them communicate what they're doing to their consumers, so that they have a credible and believable story around their climate action journey.
So I like to take a little step back and double click on the data that you guys capture. Like, I mean, like, how do you ensure that the quality, the accuracy of them, and like, you described the example of the cosmetic companies, but I mean, as I presume, you're working with many different type of companies using different type of systems, producing different type of products. So how do you, ensure that your system, your platform, your software is able to capture the right data at the right time to provide the right, results? What is the ratio between the real emission at the end of the day that are produced and what you assess? Are we at 100% or are we at 90%, 60%? And probably it's really, I think, there also interesting to understand is like, I mean, how do you ensure that with your customers? Is it automated or is it still a lot of manual work?
Yeah, so that's the where this. Let's start at the very beginning. To get a carbon footprint, you need two data sets. It's actually quite simple. You need consumption data. So how much, let's take how much PET goes into the packaging of a shampoo, right? You need to know how many tons am I procuring and using actually to produce this. So you need this data point. And that's something that we get from the companies. Or you need the data point of how much electricity are you procuring in the course of a year for your operations. So these are the consumption data that we look at. This is real data. This is data that we get from them. It is data that is validatable also through their balance sheet. It's validatable through their annual reports. You can actually, this is data that they have. The second data point is what you call the so-called emission factor. So that's the factor to calculate how many emissions actually come from this PET that's being produced. And this emission factor is something that we have on our side. And so that's one thing where we make things easy for our customers. Most systems demand that you have both data points, that you research both data points. You have the consumption data and you have the emission factor, and you have to say which is the emission factor. But there's thousands and 10,000s of emission factors out there, and different procurers of or different suppliers that deliver these emission factors, and you have to find out the right one for exactly this PET. That's what we do in our systems to enable this to have at least this one factor in the equation that is very simple. So what does what our customer needs to deliver is all the consumption data in there. Interestingly enough, how do we make sure that that is correct? Is first of all, it's the same numbers that they have in their systems that they need for their annual reports. So if companies don't have an incentive to name the wrong numbers, because there would be a discrepancy with their annual report, and large companies, especially companies in the stock market that are the listed companies, they have to have the carbon footprint audited as well, and has to be the same numbers as in the as in the annual report. So there is absolutely no incentive to cheat on sustainability data. That's the worst thing you could do. That'll fall right back on your feet. So what can happen is mistakes, of course. You have a wrong unit behind that, or you forgot to get certain data into the system, and that's something that we work with our customers to do validation points within the software, within the system, but also validation points manually in the end. We're taking probes to saying, is this the right data? Does it make sense? Is it logical? That's behind it. So on the emission factors, we just have so much experience in the meantime, and we have a huge team around data that makes sure that we have the right emission factors to calculate the footprint. The whole system is also auditable by third parties. So for, like I said, listed companies get their carbon footprints also audited. I would say if the accuracy part, we always, if you're offsetting the emissions in the end, we always add an error margin of 10%. Just to make sure that some minor mistakes are accounted for in this error margin. I think that the accuracy is fairly high, but it's still, if you're looking at this PET, if you don't have primary data of this PET produced, let's say by a chemicals company, you know exactly this PET comes from exactly this chemicals company, and they have an exact carbon footprint, there the error margin is very small in the end. But if you know they procured somewhere from Asia, then you take an average emission factor for Asian PET. So that's where a bit of the inaccuracy starts to come in, but that's something that you work on every single time you renew your carbon footprint. And that, by the way, is done once a year for a company. So you do it once a year, and that's where you do all the effort to get the data together. It's like a balance sheet. You do that once a year for your annual report as well. And for products, it's whenever you change your procurement or you change your processes, then you renew the product carbon footprint. So we try to keep the effort down to a minimum. Now, there are other methodologies of doing that. When you talk about automation, there are methodologies that you call, let's say, spend-based automation. It's let's say you take not the amount of PET that you're buying, but the euro or the dollar amount that you're buying and assessing that with a carbon footprint. So that is very inaccurate data, and that's what we typically don't do. Why? Let me make an example. You're let's say you're in Milan and you need to fly. Unfortunately, let's say you need to fly to Amsterdam from Milan, and you get an EasyJet flight and you get a KLM flight. The KLM flight costs you, let's say, 600 euros, and the EasyJet flight costs you 100 euros. So if you're assessing the carbon footprint by price, flying with EasyJet has a lower carbon footprint. 100 euros versus 600 euros. That does not make sense at all. It can make sense on a macroeconomic level, but not on a company level. So this thing, to be honest, can hardly be automated because it's still easier as a manual work to enter the data into the system, to collect the data once a year, rather than build interfaces for ERP systems, because the accuracy won't grow, but it's a lot more work to do so. But it's once a year, and once it's in the system, then you can start simulating and seeing how you can reduce your carbon emissions around that. And for that, since it's consumption-based data and you have the correct emission factors, and the more primary factors, the better, the higher the accuracy. So it's fairly good accuracy in the data that we have.
So focusing on the offset part of it, because it's like, I would say, before the labeling and the communication that you provide to your client, this offset part of it, like, I mean, how do you select the project, and how do you ensure that they deliver the quantity of CO2 that is actually like captured in the, or expected quantity to be captured? Like, I mean, which one according to you, like the most interesting in terms of ratio of amount of carbon removed, speed and cost, and where are those ones located?
Yeah, that's a whole topic in itself, the carbon offsetting, of course. So to put it one way in the beginning, without offsetting your unabated carbon emissions, you're not doing comprehensive climate action. So you must offset unabated emissions. If we were all to offset our unabated emissions, we would have a much, much lower problem with the climate crisis at the moment. If you look at current prices of carbon, but that's very status quo and ceteris paribus. If you look at that, it costs you about 1% extra of the price that you get for your product to offset your emissions. 1%. So that's 1% global GDP on top, and you actually offset the global carbon emissions of 35 gigatons a year. Imagine that. So that is a very back of the envelope calculation, of course, because the more companies offset, the more offsets you will need from projects, from different kinds of projects, and then the prices will rise. But at least you get demand and supply going. It's a bit like saying, if I switch completely all my cars to electric vehicles, oh, the grid won't work. Well, of course not, it won't work, but you have to do everything at the same time. You have to produce more renewable energy, you have to produce more cars, you have to produce the grid in order to distribute this renewable energy. Same thing counts for offsetting. So it is absolutely necessary if you want to do comprehensive climate action to do. That's one part of actually doing so. So what are the projects about? There is a system in place for carbon offset projects that actually works extremely well. It's been proven, been a proven business, a proven system around that, where NGOs define the rules around carbon offset projects and the technologies that are actually recognized as carbon offset projects. And typically there's two large NGOs that are doing that. That's the gold standard and that's the verified carbon standard. Then you have a few smaller ones as well. But those are the typical two organizations that we work with. They're standards organizations. And they say if you want to set up a carbon offset project like a clean cook stove project or a forest protection project, these are the rules by which you have to do it. These rules are there's 4 ground rules that they have to adhere to. It's well, you have to permanently remove the carbon emissions. That has to be proven. It has to be verified by third parties every single year of what actually is being reduced in carbon emissions or not produced by carbon emissions. It has to be additional, so it has to make sure that you're actually saving carbon emissions on top, and that it's not like a profitability mechanism behind it, because you have to have additional funding in order to save those carbon emissions. And you have to avoid double counting. So I can't use one project for myself and use it for your business to offset your emissions. You have to make sure that these four basic criteria are adhered to. And one very critical part about this, about additionality and double counting, is that these projects can actually only take place in developing countries. So they can't take place in like other, let's say, developed countries in Europe. There are some exceptions in the US, but in Europe, you would not be able to set a forestation project in Germany because, for example, or let's say in Belgium or in Italy, uh, because Belgium and Italy and Germany, they account for those carbon emissions that are being reduced and saved for their own balance sheet as a country. So you have to work with countries in developing countries, which is the whole idea, by the way, of this clean development mechanism of this that adheres to. We want to actually get money from industrialized countries into poorer countries, developing countries of this world, to enable them to develop sustainably, in a much better way than we did over the past centuries. So that's the idea behind it. So we only work with these with these standards, and the standards make sure that when they set up those standards, say this project has to adhere to that standard, they take a third party, like I don't know, one of the big four auditors, for example, that makes sure that those criteria are upheld. And once these criteria are upheld, and you see the carbon emissions have been saved, then you can make a credit of that, and this credit is then tradable and retirable. So we retire those credits for a business to offset the emissions of their business. And then you have several different technologies behind that. So I was talking about cook stoves. Why cook stoves? So typically in rural areas, in areas like in Africa, in Asia, and let's say we have a new project in setting up in Nepal, they're cooking their food uh, over open fireplaces, often within huts. So I don't know if you've been in an open fireplace and in a hut without chimney, but that's horrible for your health conditions. The second thing is, where do they get the fuel from? Well, they go out in the forest and collect it from the forest. So they're actually burning the forest directly, which is causing those huge carbon emissions and deterioration of biodiversity in the forest itself. Sometimes these people take a whole day, 8 hours, 9 hours a day to collect the wood to cook one meal. So no chance to go to school, no chance for doing a regular job, doing something else where they can earn money with, just to cook a meal. So what do is you help businesses, small businesses, that produce cook stoves that are much more efficient, that use, let's say, only 40% of that fuel, of that wood, and are built so that you can use them outside of a hut, or actually have chimneys to get the emissions out of the hut. So all of a sudden you've cut the emissions by 60%. That's where you can get the whole mechanism to work. You've added health. You've added 60% less work to collect the wood, and you're actually helping small businesses earn money with the cook stoves that are being subsidized with the carbon credits we're using to offset the emissions. So that's how those mechanisms work, and you really have to make sure that these mechanisms work, really including the local people that are benefiting from those mechanisms. And that's what we call like high quality carbon offset projects. um, I was, if you're looking and those are often avoiding carbon emission projects. Now, what you're talking about also is removing carbon emissions. Removing carbon emissions, there's actually two technologies around that. There's nature-based solutions and there's tech-based solutions. The nature-based solutions are typically planting trees. The problem with planting trees is, if you plant a tree today, it'll take about 10, 15, 20 years until actually these trees actually save the carbon emissions, which is a bit the difficulty around that mechanism. That's why you also have things like mangroves that grow much faster. you'll be able to save emissions within the next 5 years. Or bamboo in certain areas where it actually is a natural resource to always the idea is to reforest the forest in a natural way to sequester that carbon. And then you have technology based, direct air capture, for example, and technologies around that, which are still very much in the experimental investment phase, and which are much more expensive, but which we definitely need in the future. So we need a lot of investment in that to actually remove carbon emissions. Because in the end, once you're net zero, you have to remove the rest of the unabated emissions
Yeah.
from the atmosphere and not just avoid them. So
So
that's how we
let
a lot on that, but that's how we make sure the quality of those projects are good.
Okay, it sounds that you guys are doing a very good job on that side. So last question on my side. If you can share with us a little bit about like your competition today in the EU, in the US. I mean, why you guys are different or maybe better? How do you compare your solution to other solutions available on this very crowded market? I mean, there's quite a bit of companies proposing carbon management, carbon accounting. Everybody is trying to create value. Tell us a bit more, like what's the maybe one, two, or three main differentiators, and do you believe that it's a single players market, or more like a market where multiple players can be there to support the other companies to decarbonize their operations?
Yes. So if you recall the supply chain, like you call it, what we actually offer to our customers, it ranges from carbon measurement and accounting through reducing and abating carbon emissions to offsetting carbon emissions and communicating that. So those are the main three pillars, if you want, that we're looking at. Very often, competitors to ourselves offer singular pillars in that area. So you'll have, and that's where you're saying the market is getting very crowded, is on the carbon management and accounting systems. There you have a lot of startups, a lot of investment going into that where this measurement is taking place. Definitely, I'll talk to that on that about that a little bit later. Then you have the whole reducing and avoiding of carbon emissions. It's a huge, 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 huge sector, and there's, if you're looking at competition there, it ranges from small consulting companies all the way up to the big four that are actually doing, and strategy consulting companies that are moving into the sector, that are actually consulting on how do I really reduce my carbon emissions on a really macro level. How do I change my operations as a car producing company in order to become net zero? So you'll have the big four in there. You'll have the McKinseys, the BCGs, and then the big four, Deloitte's, EYs. They're all trying to get a piece of that cake, and we all need very in-depth consulting there as well. So that is, in that sense, somehow also a bit of our competition, whereas we don't do that in depth of the consulting as, say, Deloitte would, right? And then you have the carbon offset part, and the carbon offset part is we have many carbon offset project developers out there that are developing fantastic projects and that are really, really good at that as well. I think where we're unique about is, like I said, the whole bandwidth of this, and combining it with software, with the reduction and the offsetting part of things. Looking again at the first part, measuring and carbon management, if you look very closely, you'll see that a lot of the startups coming about are looking at the measuring of carbon footprints of digital businesses. Looks like tech companies and services, which is, I don't want to be disrespectful there, but it's fairly easy to carbon footprint a tech business or a service company, as opposed to a manufacturing company that has multiple manufacturing facilities across the globe. It's a very different topic there. It took us very many years to build solutions in different industries that are industry specific. So carbon footprinting, I don't know, let's say a delivery service is fairly easy as compared to carbon footprinting, a pizza producer, a large food producer behind it, and say how do I get the carbon footprint of that done in a manageable and easy and accessible way, and supporting that with software. So it's a huge, it's exponential complexity in there. And that's where we differentiate ourselves, having this knowledge already in place, where there's a lot of catch up to do there with others. Um, I think that's so, and like some companies that are very similar to ours, I would say there's two or three out there that are similar to us. And so I think there's room for several companies. There's a lot of consolidation going on out there, but it's not a single fix all. There's enough to do for all of us out there.
So thank you so much. Last question on my side. I know we are, as usual, running a little bit out of time. But what's your personal opinion on the climate crisis? I mean, what would be your words to people who feel demoralized by all the visible consequences and all of those alarming news that we have constantly? I mean, as I always ask, are we doomed? What do you want to tell them?
So you know there's the experiment with the frog in the water, the boiling water. So if you have a boiling water or hot water, it doesn't have to be boiling water. If you have hot water and you throw a frog into the hot water, it'll jump out right away because it feels the hot water. If you have the frog in the water and you slowly heat the water and it turns hot, it won't move. And we're a bit in the situation of the latter, right? The things that are happening or changing over the past decades have not affected us strongly. And we're saying, well, what's the problem? You know, we have a little more rain in California now this winter, a little more snow, or we have yeah, there was a big blizzard in New York, in Buffalo a few weeks ago, right? So it's changing though. It's changing. The consumer awareness, the awareness of the individual is getting much more acute. I remember the fact, and one of the reasons why Greta Thunberg hit the streets and started striking for more climate action. That was in 2018, and there was a huge drought in Europe at the time. I remember there's a photograph from a German astronaut that he took a picture of Europe, and it looked like Africa, like North, like you know, it was everything was brown. So we are all of a sudden seeing the consequences of climate action, and we're all of a sudden talking about not abating and not mitigating, but financing, you know, the destruction that's happening, and how to actually cope with climate action. So now, I think the world is waking up to what's happening, and there's a lot more pressure from media, from consumers, from Generation Z, from investors, from politicians to actually change things. Um, so there is awareness finally there, and the first thing to take a step to do something about something is if you're aware of it. You know, you only start running, going to jog if you're aware that, oh my gosh, I have to really put on a few too many pounds, and my friends are telling me, yeah, you're fat, go run. That's when you start to go running. You don't necessarily do it on your own, right? So now the awareness is there and people are taking action. The second thing, what I'm very optimistic about, is the singularity effect of technology that you have. So uh, if you look back at the way the technology has developed in the past years, in every standpoint where we are as persons, we think linearly. A person thinks linearly and taking what has happened in the past and linearly projects the development of the future. If you look at every single point in time, this development in technology is exponential. So you would not have been able to say let's say in the 50s, you wouldn't have thought that you would be flying to the moon in the 60s. So and that's what's happening with this the singularity effect as well at the moment. I believe that if we open the pathways to investment into new technology, to climate tech, that we as human beings, as a race, as a human being, as a species, as a species, will be able to come up with the solutions that we need to actually abate carbon emissions, to become more fuel efficient, and actually to produce green energy for most of the things and solutions out there, and actually produce technological solutions for other, for agricultural, for industrial processes that reduce carbon emissions or avoid carbon emissions in the first place. But that needs awareness. The awareness needs investment. If the investment is there, I'm truly optimistic that we can actually beat this climate crisis in the near future.
So how can our listeners of founders, investors, experts on the world can help you today?
How can they help us today? I think I think what the and that's an interesting thing that you see in sports, kind of like the Olympic idea around it. You know, if you go to the Olympics, it's mostly not about competing against the other person. It's about being there together. And then the one person is, might be get the gold medal, the other person might get the silver medal. But in the end, it's about the Olympic thought of actually participating in the whole effort, actually being there. And that's what I feel in the climate realm and the climate tech realm is we're not competing with one another. We're working together with one another. And that's what we need. And we're reaching out to one another to help each other to get those technologies and get this movement forward. And wherever we can see that this helping one another to get access to, I don't know, access to capital, access to customers, access to new ideas, access to projects and development and collaboration across supply chains. That is, I think, where we can all help each other in this climate tech realm.
Thank you so much, Tristan, for your time, for your incredible insights on the industry. Again, I'm super excited to see so many brilliant people like you taking the time and putting so much time and energy and effort into the fighting the climate crisis, and especially in your case in enabling other companies to have a larger impact. So, thank you so much.
Guillaume, thank you very much for having me. It was fantastic. Thanks for the great questions and good luck and thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks again for joining us on the Tech for Climate podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. Stay tuned next week for more climate tech insights. In the meantime, head on over to our webpage at startupbasecamp.org, where we have lots more insights and resources for anyone wanting to get involved in climate tech. If you find our resources useful, please consider donating to support our small self-funded team. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. And see you next time.